Hey, Science 30s. Today we're going to be discussing topic 1.3 of acid deposition, the impact of acid deposition on ecosystems. Before I get started, I just want to make a clarification to the last video, the part 2 video of the 1.2 section about the chemistry of acids and bases. I discussed there as part of that video how to calculate pH from hydronium concentrations, and I may not have explained the rationale behind the formula as well as I probably could have. So again, the formula for this is pH equals the negative log 10 of the concentration of hydronium. Now what I've drawn here is the example that was on the very first page of that section of the notes, in which we were trying to calculate the pH of a substance that had a hydronium concentration of 6.7 times 10 to the 8th moles per liter. If I take that value as is, 6.7 times 10 to the 8th, and I calculate the log 10 of it by clicking the log 10 on my calculator, that button, I'm going to get a value of negative 7.1739. That's why there's a negative in front of the log 10, because in this case, I can't have a negative pH. I've got a negative value that's being calculated off the log 10. I have to negative the negative. So there's a negative times a negative, which in math, you know, if I take a negative times a negative, I'm going to get a positive. So that's how I get a positive value for the pH, which is in this case, there's not really positive pH, but you understand that it's a number that's between 0 and 14. In this case, the number would be, if I round it to one decimal place, the value would be 7.2 for pH. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit, and I apologize if that part of the video maybe wasn't as well described as I could have, and if you were having issues with the calculations on that part. But hopefully that explains it a little bit better for you. All right, let's move on to today's topic, which is, again, acid deposition and its effect on ecosystems. Acid deposition, as we've talked about in 1.1, there's all sorts of forms of acid deposition due to anthropogenic sources here in the planet, mainly the burning of fossil fuels. A lot of oxides are released into the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide. They're all responsible for forms of acid deposition. And again, they can fall in two forms. Either they can combine with water to form wet deposition, or they can fall as either solid particles or gaseous particles and in the form of what we call dry deposition. But both of them are going to have impacts on the ecosystem. And when they impact an ecosystem, as you're well aware, ecosystems are not just organisms, they're also the environment around the organism. So when we have damage to an ecosystem because of acid deposition, it's not just going to affect the biotic components of the ecosystem, the living components of the ecosystem, but it will also damage the abiotic components or the non-living components of the ecosystem, like, for example, the soil, which we'll be discussing today. How does acid rain actually affect soil? In Alberta, we get a lot of dry deposition, which I mentioned to you in section 1.1, but we're actually sheltered from the effects of all the acid deposition that we're creating as part of our oil sands and our extraction of oil up in the north and other parts of the province. And the reason for that is the soil that surrounds our lake are actually fairly alkaline. They are very basic. Anytime you hear the word alkaline, it refers to something that is basic, something that's above 7 on the pH scale. Now, why is our soil so basic? Well, the reason why is there's lots of calcium carbonate in the soil. And if you remember back to our discussions about page 12 on your data sheet, if I look at carbonate, the ion, it's actually a very strong base. So the calcium carbonate in the soil, the carbonate would react with any acid that's coming into the soil, and it would actually create a neutralization reaction or a Bronsted-Lowry acid-base reaction in which the acid coming in would become a conjugate base, a conjugate base, and then the strong base, the carbonate, would become a very weak conjugate acid. So it's because of this that we actually have our lakes have sort of almost a magical ability, and not magical, it's all based in science, but they have the ability to withstand changes in pH because of this carbonate that's in the soil. Now, why is this? Why do we have all this calcium carbonate in our soil? Well, it stems back to the age of the dinosaurs. Back in the day, parts of Alberta, along the eastern front of Alberta, were part of an inland sea that had lots of marine organisms, and marine organisms, a lot of them produced shells, and these shells actually will decompose and will actually form into calcium carbonate, which essentially is limestone. So these organisms that lived in the seas around Alberta over 65 million years ago, they have deposited themselves into the soil. The remnants of them are in our soil, and that's what gives us this great alkaline soil that is so resistant to acid deposition. If you want to take a look at how that actually occurred, here's a little link here, a little look back at the history of Alberta and why that's occurred, and it gives you a little bit of information about that inland sea that actually once extended literally right through the middle of North America, all the way up from the Arctic Ocean, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So give that one a look if you want at this point. So basically, the carbonate ions that are in the soil are going to react with any hydronium that's coming down from the acid that's being deposited through, in this case in Alberta, mainly dry deposition. And the reaction is going to lead to the hydronium becoming a conjugate base, in this case of water. And you know that water is very neutral, so it's very close to 7, which is great. And then the carbonate ions will accept the proton or the hydrogen ion from the hydronium in that Bronsted-Lowry reaction, and it will become ions of bicarbonate, which is considered to be an acid, but it is a very weak acid. And again, you can see that by looking on the chart. Hydrogen carbonate ions or bicarbonate are considered to be among the weakest of the acids. So we're basically taking a strong acid and basically nullifying it into a very weak acid, and we're also producing water. So this is why the soil has this amazing ability to basically neutralize the acid that's coming down. Now, the process by which this occurs, the process by which a substance basically can neutralize an acid in this case, or you can also talk about how a substance can neutralize a base, because it does work on both ends of the pH scale. That process is called buffering. Anytime you hear the word buffering, it basically refers to a substance that's able to basically neutralize an acid and just be able to nullify the effects of an acid if it comes into, in this case, an ecosystem or in any kind of a system where acids are being added. It could be something in a beaker that is neutralizing acid as you pour it in. That there are substances that are much better at buffering than others, and they generally tend to be ones that are fairly decent. In the case of this, they would be decent bases. If I was buffering a base, it would be a fairly decent acid that would be able to nullify the effects of a base if it was added into. But in our case, in the ecosystems, generally we're dealing with acids that are being added, not basic substances. So we're looking for bases in the environment that can buffer the effects of our acid deposition. Now, the amount of acid or a base that can be neutralized by a buffer is known as that buffer's, we call that buffering capacity. So how much of an acid can I dump into a lake in Alberta without me seeing a drop in the pH? And the more effective a buffer is at neutralizing the acid in this case, or again, it could be in the case of neutralizing a base, it does work both ways, like I've said. The more it's able to withstand changes in pH, the longer it can withstand a change in pH as you add more of an acid or more of a base. It's considered to have a higher buffering capacity. And as far as buffers are concerned, we've talked about, at least indirectly in the last unit, we talked about buffers that occur in the human bloodstream. We talked about how when carbon dioxide forms in our body, we know that carbon dioxide in the presence of water, as we discussed in topic 1.1 of this unit, it's going to form carbonic acid. Well, that is basically a very weak acid, and basically the ability to react and counteract with this basically allows our pH to be, it will drop in our blood, but there is a buffering effect that's going on in our blood. We do see drops in pH because of carbonic acid, but because it's a weak acid, we're not seeing extreme drops. So there is a bit of a buffering effect going on even in our bloodstream. But when you discuss buffering capacity, and there's a graph here on the notes, and I've also drawn the opposite graph here on my whiteboard. The one in the notes, this one here, is referring to a buffer that is resisting the addition of a base. And you can see that the pH starts off at roughly 5 in this solution. And then as we add more of a base, which is the bottom of the x-axis on the graph, you're seeing that certain buffers are, basically seeing changes to the pH, very dramatic changes in pH, some very quickly, some not at all, depending on the strength of the buffer. So this graph here, when you see the graph going up, is referring to the buffering capacity of a substance that's buffering for a base. My diagram here would be more of what's happening with acid deposition. This is going to show you buffering. There's 4 buffering agents that I've drawn. I've got buffering agent 1 in blue, buffering agent 2 in red, buffering agent 3 in green, and buffering agent 4 in black. They are all basically there to neutralize an acid that's being added into a system, into a beaker, into something. But the question is, based on this graph, which of these buffering agents has the highest buffering capacity? Which one does the job the best? Which one resists the change in pH the most? Now, I'm going to give you a couple seconds. I'm going to get you to click on the old card up here, put in your predictions as to what you think, which of these buffering agents is going to be the most effective, which one has the highest buffering capacity. All right, well, the one that has the most buffering capacity is, just waiting for you in case you were still putting your answer in, the one that's got the best buffering capacity is in fact buffering agent number 1. And the reason why is this. This section here where the line stays straight is indicating that the buffering is working, that it's actually resisting the acid that's being entered into the system. The acid is having little or no effect on the pH for the longest amount of time. So they all buffer, but number 1 does the best job because it resists the change in pH of the acid being added, because that would make the solution drop eventually, and it does. Eventually the pH does drop down to 2, but it takes the longest amount of time with buffering agent number 1. So it has the highest buffering capacity. Buffering agent number 2 has the second highest. Number 3 has the third best or second worst buffering capacity. And buffering agent number 4, basically only a small amount of acid is entered, and then basically you can see here the drop off in the pH. In this diagram here that's on the slide in front of you, the buffering agent that is most effective is, quite frankly, it's the one that is the 1.00 mole buffer. The one that's the strongest, you can see that line doesn't even move at all. The one that's the worst or has the worst buffering capacity on this graph down here would be the distilled water, because almost immediately, as soon as you start adding the base, the pH basically rises right away. So when we're dealing with buffering capacity, you might see something like this on a graph, and you might have to interpret the data from that graph. And if you're looking for information about that, check on page 219 of the textbook. There's a great diagram there to help you out as well. All right. Acid deposition can also impact the conversion of elements, so the abiotic factors in an ecosystem, such as carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, which we've already discussed. All of these elements run through the ecosystems in what are called biogeochemical cycles. So they run through the biology, they run through biological organisms, they run through the earth, the geo, and they are chemicals that are cycling through. So for example, you and I, when we breathe in and out, I mean, we're breathing in oxygen and then we're spewing out carbon dioxide. Because of that, we are contributing to the carbon cycle. We are releasing carbon, which will then be processed by plants for photosynthesis. Then they basically spew out the oxygen. That's the way it's supposed to happen. nitrogen. It basically runs through a cycle where atmospheric nitrogen gets converted into nitrates and ammonium, and basically gets converted into food systems or food webs where it can be converted by organisms in those food chains. And again, if you look on the slide here, there's just some examples of why, and there's also micronutrients that run through our ecosystems as well. There are some elements which are what are considered micronutrients. We need very small amounts of them, and there are ones that we need large amounts of. So for example, nitrogen is considered a macronutrient because we need lots of it to basically produce proteins. Proteins basically all have nitrogen in them, and we need large amounts of nitrogen, and DNA also has a lot of nitrogen in it as well. So we need those in larger amounts in our body. But then we have other elements like calcium, iron, zinc. We need them in small amounts. Calcium, obviously, for bone growth. We need it in plants. They need them for cell walls to grow roots. In iron, they require it. We need it for hemoglobin. Plants require it for chlorophyll. Zinc, again, required for forms of protein synthesis. So there's these elements that we need, but only in small amounts. Now, what acid deposition can do is it can basically screw that up. It can basically, where there's these elements are in the soil, they can actually now maybe come out more than they should be. We're seeing more of these elements, these micronutrients that are basically flooding into organisms, and particularly plants, because they've got their root systems directly in the soil. And that's obviously a big deal because they are the base of every food chain that's pretty much above ground. At least that we're dealing with, in our neck of the woods here in Alberta, right? So as the pH of the soil drops, plants will find it more difficult. In some cases, they'll find it more difficult to actually get these nutrients at all. So because the pH of the soil changes, some of these nutrients will actually get locked in the soil. They'll essentially just not be available. An example of this would be, which you can see in the slide right here, chlorellus, which is basically a yellowing of plant leaves due to a lack of chlorophyll because of a lack of a couple of micronutrients like zinc, like iron, like magnesium. So that can be an issue, that when we have acid deposition in soil, it can lock up certain nutrients that plants need to basically do well. And that's going to affect the entire ecosystem, because these plants are the base of the food chain that are basically producing the glucose that basically powers all the organisms above it, right? So that's a major issue. However, they also have the other effect is that sometimes they will release substances that we don't want or that we need in very small quantities, but now we're going to flood organisms with certain substances that if they're in small quantities, okay, we need them in very small quantities, but if there are too much of them, now they can actually become poisons. They can actually poison organisms because we're releasing certain elements or ions into the ecosystem. This is known as leaching, where certain poisons or substances are basically being drawn out of the soil in larger than normal concentrations. And a good example of this is aluminum. Aluminum is normally found in rocks in a form that is called aluminum hydroxide, which has the formula OH3. When it reacts with hydronium, it undergoes an acid base reaction. Hydronium is the acid. Aluminum hydroxide is going to be your base, and it's going to they're going to swap some protons, and we're going to get the formation of water. The hydronium will become the weak conjugate base of water, and aluminum hydroxide will actually form, and you're getting aluminum hydroxide ions that are going to form. And what it's also going to do, and this is the big part of this reaction, this is really what you need to know. This you don't really need to know as much, but this is the thing you need to know, is that when aluminum hydroxide reacts with hydronium, it's going to release aluminum ions. And these aluminum ions are basically going to flood into soils that are affected by acid deposition, and that's going to have a whole range of issue effects on plants. For example, you're going to get decreased growth of roots. They're going to get you're going to prevent them from uptaking some micronutrients that they require, including calcium. So they actually block other nutrients from getting into the plant. And they also reduce populations of decomposing bacteria in the soil that are required to actually increase the nutrient value of the soil. So this aluminum, this leaching of aluminum because of acid deposition in the soil is a major deal for plants. Now, another example of another substance that increases in acidic soils is mercury. Mercury ions, Hg2 plus ions, are going to increase in the presence of acidic soil. And they basically, well, mercury. Mercury is a poison. When you think mercury, there really isn't anything other than that most people think of. And what happens is, in both of these cases, in aluminum and mercury, you're going to get something known as biomagnification or bioaccumulation. You release aluminum into the soil, you release mercury into the soil. Those are going to get drawn up by plants. The plants are going to absorb these poisons into them. Then they get eaten by another organism. That organism now gets more of that poison. Then that organism gets eaten by another organism, just like in the diagram here. And the further up the food chain you go, the higher the concentration of that poison gets, the further up you go. Again, bioaccumulation or biomagnification. And this is one of the reasons why there's these warnings for pregnant women not to eat a lot of seafood, because tuna is a very high predator on the ocean ecosystem, and when it consumes organisms lower down from it, it's got larger amounts of mercury in it than other organisms that are below it in the food chain. So you consume that as a pregnant woman. It may not affect you because you're fairly, relatively speaking, a fairly large organism. But if you're pregnant, your fetus, your embryo, very small, is going to be very heavily affected by mercury. There can be a lot of neural damage that can happen to that fetus or embryo. Just take a quick little peek at this video here, and this is going to talk to you about why pregnant women generally are not going to be wanting to eat a lot of seafood during their pregnancies. And then finally, well, it goes without saying, all this stuff that's happening with acid deposition, whether it's the leaching or whether it's the preventing of plants from getting specific micronutrients, or all these things that are basically going on with the soil that affect the plants that are in the soil. You're affecting both the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. This is going to have a major impact on the biodiversity of any given ecosystem. You cannot pepper an ecosystem year after year after year after year with acid deposition and not expect to see eventually see some symptoms. Now, and again, in Alberta, we're lucky because we've got soils that have very high buffering capacities. But as you see, any substance that has a buffering capacity, eventually the capacity will end. So if you continually add acid and acid and acid and acid and acid, eventually the soil will give out. We just have the luck that our soil is much more tolerant to it. If you go to areas like Ontario, they are very, very susceptible to acid deposition because they don't have calcium carbonate in their soil. They have granite bedrock, and that type of bedrock, there's no buffering capacity at all. That water enters the water, or that acid enters the watershed in areas like Ontario, and the pH of those watersheds drop almost immediately. So there's a lot of, there are certain areas of the world that aren't as lucky as we are in Alberta, but don't think that we are completely immune, because eventually all buffers will run out of buffering capacity, and it's only a matter of time if we continue to hit our ecosystem with acid deposition. Finally, before we finish up today, here's your recap video right up here. Give that sucker a watch, and that'll kind of wrap up everything we've talked about today about acid rain. And your homework based on what we've discussed today. I'm going to get you to work on questions 1 to 5, questions 7 and 8, and questions 10 and 11 on pages 201 and 202 of the textbook. That's it for today, guys and gals. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.